My name is Emily, in my early 30s, currently living in the suburbs of Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm a remote interior designer, a job that gives me plenty of creative freedom and control over my own life. Caleb and I have been married for 5 years. His family has always emphasized traditional values, where a woman must be gentle, modest, and completely adapt to her husband's household. Although I didn't fully agree with that, I still tried to play the role of a proper wife in their eyes. When we decided to buy a house, we chose a small and cozy place. Contrary to how it appeared, that the house belonged to both of us, the truth is, I paid for the entire cost, and I'm the sole owner listed on the title. I spent months designing that home, from drafting mood boards, hunting for antiques at flea markets, to crafting handmade items myself. Everything bore my personal touch. Nothing flashy, but full of heart. My husband had no interest in aesthetics. Whenever I asked for his input, he would simply say, "You're the expert here. Just do it your way." I thought everything was settling down. Until the day they came. That day started just like any other weekend. But I could never have predicted it would become a moment where I would be forced to face such a cold truth. My husband's family, the ones I had always tried to blend in with, though never truly felt a part of, came for a visit. They arrived like important guests, and I had prepared everything meticulously, from the fragrant pie to the piping hot coffee I knew they liked. I wanted them to feel the warmth in every detail of the home I had carefully created, a home I could proudly call my own. I lit candles, made small dishes, and tried to craft a welcoming atmosphere, as if to invite loved ones into the space I had poured my soul into. But the moment they stepped in, I instantly realized things weren't going to go the way I'd hoped. My mother-in-law, Miranda, entered with a faint smile, looked around, and remarked with a cold expression, "Ah, modern style, huh?" The words hit me like a bucket of cold water. I could only offer a forced smile, trying to stay composed while my chest tightened. Then Caleb's sister, Jessa, scanned the room again, furrowed her brow, and added, "Doesn't feel like a family home." Her voice was full of criticism, with no attempt to hide it, as if she were blaming me. My father-in-law just stared at the wall, silent, but his gaze alone was enough to convey his disapproval. Things became uncomfortable from the very first words. I didn't even have time to react before Caleb and his father began carrying in a bunch of large boxes, which I had no idea why they were even in my house. New rugs, wall art, lamps, decorative items. All things I never asked for and certainly didn't want. I saw my mother-in-law smiling meaningfully, as if she had long awaited this moment, and then she said something that made me feel even more uneasy. A wife should reflect the values of her husband's family. That's essential. That sentence was another bucket of cold water poured over me. And in that moment, I realized clearly that I was not the one in control of my own home. Everything I had built and designed was being dismissed. The items I had carefully chosen, the artwork and decorations I had lovingly curated, were suddenly taken down and replaced with things I had never wanted. Rough maroon curtains replaced the soft white ones. Heavy religious statues were placed everywhere. Tacky fake flowers and wooden boards with Bible verses replaced my meaningful handmade pieces. My heart grew heavy, and I stood silently, saying nothing. But what stunned me the most was Caleb. The husband I thought would stand by my side was just standing there, doing nothing to stop his mother and sisters. Not only did he stay silent, but he helped them set everything up exactly where they wanted. He didn't look at me, didn't offer a single word of comfort. He just stood there, as if completely unaware that I was right in front of him, witnessing everything I had built being replaced without mercy. Everything happened so slowly, so quietly. Even though I was sitting right there in the living room, watching each familiar item being taken away and replaced with things I would never choose, I didn't react. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't raise my voice. I just sat there quietly, as if watching a movie that wasn't about my life. My heart felt frozen, my emotions locked away, leaving only silence, a silence so suffocating. It felt like everything was falling into a space where I no longer had control, and I was no longer the owner of this home. When everything was over, I still sat there, absorbing what had just happened. Caleb said only one sentence, gently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Don't overthink it. You already know what my family is like. That wasn't comfort. It wasn't sympathy either. It was merely a detached statement, as if everything had been predetermined, and I, as his wife, had no right to change any of it. That night, I stayed awake, but not to cry or curse fate, not even to wait for my husband to change or realize anything. I knew that would never happen. Instead, I made a plan with no rush, no loud steps. I would do everything slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing. The next morning, I began to act. I quietly contacted a storage company to rent a storage unit. I had calculated everything carefully. I didn't want anything to happen too hastily. Everything would be done gently and perfectly, without a trace for them to detect. Then, I called Robert, a former friend in the furniture handling business. He was someone I trusted, and I had once helped him design his office space when he first started. I asked him to prepare a team, and everything would take place Friday night, when no one would be paying attention. Everything continued in silence. For the whole following week, I pretended to be cheerful, even feigning excitement when they kept sending over their additional furniture. They thought I was accepting it all, that I would let them freely transform our home into whatever they wanted. But in my heart, I was counting down every day, every hour, until the full sweep. Each time they brought in a new piece of furniture, I smiled, but only I knew I was preparing for an irreversible change. Friday night arrived with a strange tension, like everything in the house was waiting for something. My in-laws brought more unacceptable items. Purple floral chairs with loud patterns as if they were decorating a gloomy garden, an enormous wooden cross, and a tapestry embroidered with the phrase, "May blessings remain here." Everything was heavy, not just physically, but spiritually. Each item felt like a sign of possession, an unbearable imposition. But I didn't react. I smiled. I smiled as if I were welcoming honored guests, but inside, it was different. Every smile was a performance, a scene in which I played the obedient wife, someone who could endure this manipulation and oppression. My husband remained indifferent, saying nothing. He stood there, eyes glued to his phone, as if nothing happening around him concerned him. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask how I felt. I knew everything had gone beyond his ability to change. He was no longer someone I could hope for, no longer someone I could rely on to protect what I had built. Now, all I could do was wait. At exactly 11 p.m., as scheduled, Robert and his team arrived with two large trucks. No greetings, no unnecessary words. They quietly stepped in, ready to begin. Everything had been meticulously planned. Not a single noise. Robert's team worked like ghosts in the night, making no sound, not disturbing the artificial peace Caleb's family had imposed. I stood there in the middle of the room, silently observing everything. No unnecessary gestures, no words, just the work and the determination. By 2 a.m., every item from my in-laws had disappeared. The heavy rugs, the oversized paintings, the religious objects they had placed everywhere gone. No trace, not a single shard left behind. The pieces I had chosen, the handmade items I had lovingly cared for over the months, had now returned to where they truly belonged. The feeling was indescribable. Everything had returned to the beginning, the home I had built from the first bricks, from the very first thoughts of a real sanctuary. The bamboo rattan sofa I had found in a vintage store, the salt lamp I loved for its warm glow, the handmade ceramic vases I personally picked out, everything was back in its rightful place. And most importantly, the air in the house. Peace, stillness, the freedom of an unviolated space. I stood in the center of the room, among the familiar objects I had created, and took a deep breath. There was no more invasion, no more suffocating pressure from things I never wanted. I felt freedom flooding the space. It felt like I had truly stepped into my own home for the first time, after a long period of being surrounded and manipulated by things that didn't belong to me. At that moment, I realized something with absolute clarity. Sometimes, silence and calm are the most powerful weapons. When we have no other choice, when words no longer carry weight, action becomes the answer. The next morning, as I sat in the living room with a hot cup of coffee, the doorbell rang. I knew immediately they would come again. Caleb's family, predictably, had returned once more with the intent of finishing what they called decorating. Every time they came, I felt like I was being pushed further out of my own space, as if I were just a stranger in the very home I had built. I opened the door and saw them standing there, familiar faces, but this time I felt no sense of welcome. Jessa was the first to speak, her voice full of confusion and surprise. "Where's all this stuff?" Her question felt like a punch to my patience. I looked at her, not in a hurry to respond, and calmly took a sip of my coffee, feeling each drop pass through my teeth, reminding me that I was the one in control now. I replied in a composed voice, "Must have been a break-in last night. Took everything." The words were light, but each syllable like an arrow aimed straight at them. Impossible to miss the chill in my tone. My mother-in-law, Miranda, asked with a trembling voice, clearly unable to grasp what was happening. She shook her head, looked around, then looked at me like I was some alien being. Molly, who rarely spoke but always made sure her words had bite, shouted, "You have no right to throw away all our stuff." I didn't move. I wasn't shaken. All I could think was, it was time for them to understand this house was no longer theirs. I placed the ownership certificate on the table, not hastily, but each word on that paper felt like a final declaration of sovereignty. This house belongs to me legally, clearly. You are just guests, and no one has the right to change this place without permission. My words were calm but firm. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain much. The whole room fell into silence for a moment, filled only with the weight of the tension between us. Miranda slammed her hand on the table, her face flushing red, her voice sharp and furious. "Outsider, you don't belong in this home." I didn't react. Her words didn't hurt me. They only proved one thing to me, that she still refused to understand I had lived in this house with my heart and devotion. I turned to Caleb, unable to hold back anymore. "Can you say it clearly, right here in front of everyone? What exactly have you contributed to this house?" My question wasn't meant to trap him, but to force him to face the truth. My words struck at the long-held silence he had tried to maintain. He didn't respond. The entire room seemed to freeze in that moment, and I realized I wasn't just fighting his family. I was fighting him too, the man I had once trusted. A few days later, as I was going through the storage in the garage, something started to feel off. A strange uneasiness crept in, as if someone was right there beside me, watching my every move. At first, it was just a vague feeling. But then things became clearer as I began checking the precious items I had carefully stored. The things I cherished, piece by piece, were no longer intact. Some had disappeared, the handcrafted ceramic vases I loved, the vintage photo frames, the objects I had found during countless thrift shop hunts, all gone. Upon closer inspection, I discovered clear signs of tampering. The lock on the storage unit had been forced open, boxes had been rifled through, and several items, though not of high monetary value but deeply meaningful to me, had been taken. It felt like someone had violated my private space, as if they had no regard for my ownership, and I hadn't even received a warning. I couldn't let this continue. I asked Caleb, hoping for a reasonable explanation, or at least some acknowledgement of what was happening. But he just looked at me, eyes distant, as if trying to avoid the truth. Eventually, he admitted it. He had given the key to Jessa without telling me. Another shock. My whole body stiffened at those words. I said nothing. I just quietly walked inside and began changing every single lock. It was time to stop letting things happen behind my back. If they wouldn't respect me or this home, well, then I had nothing left to lose. Soon after, Jessa came again, returning a few of the items that had gone missing. But what she brought back only made me feel like I was living in a story with no end. Those items were no longer as they had been. They had been used. Candle wax was stuck to the lamps I loved. A photo frame had a torn corner, and there were obvious signs that they had been touched, rummaged through. It wasn't just about returning belongings. It was a challenge, a sign of disrespect for what I had built. As a quiet anger began to rise within me, I decided to check Caleb's email. I didn't want to do this, but I knew I couldn't let everything pass without understanding more about what was going on. When I found the draft in his email, I couldn't believe my eyes. It contained only one sentence. "Also replace the shelf Grandma left when she's out of the house." Those words felt like a slap in the face. They hadn't just rearranged the items in my home. They were planning to continue doing so behind my back, as if I didn't exist in my own life. They were quietly transforming my home, turning it into something unrecognizable. Everything seemed like part of a premeditated plan, and I was merely an outsider, ignored, excluded from the very space I had worked so hard to create. Everything became clear. They weren't just trespassing on my property, they were intruding on my control over my own life. Now I understood. It wasn't just the house they were taking, it was also the power I held within this life. Gradually, the truth unfolded. What they were doing wasn't just about replacing furniture. We had shared a life together, a home I had painstakingly built, not just with money, but with love and effort. And now, the little traces they left in every corner of this space were slowly turning it into something that no longer belonged to me. First, it was the furniture. Then came the suggestive comments. Finally, I knew what I had to do to uncover the full story. When I followed the trail of storage rental receipts I found in Caleb's email, I couldn't believe it. He, the husband I had trusted and loved, had secretly signed a contract to store the items his family brought in. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a staged plan, a conspiracy carried out without my involvement. The furniture they brought, the changes they made to my home, all of it was premeditated and carefully executed. When I arrived at that storage unit, I couldn't have imagined what I was about to face. The door opened, and immediately, I felt as though I were standing inside another version of my own house. Everything was identical to the point that I gasped, unable to believe my eyes. A perfect replica, every detail recreated, complete with furniture and decorations, but not the ones I had chosen. They were the things Caleb's family had imposed on me. They had seized my space, turning the house into a version I couldn't recognize, a place I never wanted. I stood there, frozen. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about replacing objects. It was a substitution, a sinister approach I hadn't realized until now. They wanted to replace me, not just physically, but in my role in this life. These weren't just objects. They were symbols of conquest and imposition. I looked around, every painting, every chair, every rug. They were all things I couldn't accept, things I could no longer call mine. There was no more anger. I didn't feel the urge to scream or resist. I felt only stillness. That stillness said everything. I had been replaced, not by a surface level change, but by an assault on the home and private world that I had built. I hadn't just lost my favorite things. I had lost control over my own life. At that moment, I knew what I needed to do. I took out my phone and began taking pictures of everything, documenting every detail so nothing would be missed. These photos would be evidence, the documentation that would clearly prove what they had done. And now, all I had to do was return to my home and reclaim control. I was no longer angry, but I saw more clearly than ever. They had wanted to replace me, not just with furniture, but with another presence in my very own home. They didn't just want to alter the space I had created. They wanted to erase me from this life, as if I had never existed. One evening, I drove to Miranda's house, a place where I had always felt like an outsider, someone who never truly belonged. My husband's entire family was present. I knew they wouldn't leave me alone, but tonight, I wasn't afraid. Things had gone too far. Every decision had already been made in my mind. I walked in, neither fast nor slow, allowing everyone to feel the silence I carried with me. No greetings, no words. I walked to the center of the room and placed the document bag on the table. All eyes turned to me. I didn't need to say anything because everything I had to say was already inside those documents, those photos, those pieces of evidence I was about to lay out before them. I didn't need harsh words or raised voices. I only needed the truth, and the truth would speak for itself. I laid out the documents, each page, each photo placed on the table without haste, without fear. The evidence was clear, transparent, undeniable. The room fell into thick silence. No one spoke. Only the sound of their breathing remained, as if no one dared to face what I was about to reveal. Finally, Caleb spoke, but his voice no longer carried the confidence it once did. I was wrong. Things have gone too far. His words struck me like a slap. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a belated realization of what he had done. But I no longer needed an apology. What I needed was change, the acknowledgement that I was not dependent on anyone, not just somebody's wife, but myself, a woman with a right to control her own life. Jessa immediately pushed back, as if she couldn't accept that things were beyond her control. Miranda began to scold me, her voice sharp and accusatory, as if I were the one who had ruined everything. But I didn't respond. I was too tired of those baseless criticisms. Not today, not here. I would no longer let their words control me. I pulled out the prepared papers, not rushing, not blaming anyone. I just wanted them to see the truth, to understand that I wasn't weak or someone they could manipulate. Caleb is removed from all ownership rights, I said with a firm voice, without a moment's hesitation. The property is now fully confirmed under my name. Those words were not revenge. They were an act of restoring justice, of reclaiming the power I deserved. You have 48 hours to remove all personal belongings, I continued, my voice steady. No weakness, no forgiveness. They had gone too far, and I could not let this continue. There was no need to explain further. Everything was already crystal clear. No one could undo these decisions. I looked at them, and finally, I looked at Caleb, the man who had once been my husband, the one I had hoped would stand by me. I said to him, my voice calm but powerful, "You tried to erase me from this life, but the mistake you made is that I'm the only one who ever truly belonged here." I didn't need to say another word. What I said was enough. Now, I had not only reclaimed the house, I had reclaimed respect and taken back the power over my own life. They could protest. They could be angry. But I knew that from this day forward, nothing would ever be the same again. Caleb's final day in the house came like a cold wind. He said nothing, not a word of apology, not a single explanation. Only silence, heavy like a wound that would never heal. He quietly packed up his things, one by one, not in a rush, but with no delay either. I didn't want to see him. I didn't feel the need to offer comfort, or to say anything that might ease his sadness. He hadn't thought of me when I needed him, so now I wouldn't think of him either. Everything was perfectly clear. The silence between us seemed like the only way nothing would get lost. Only a few quiet tears fell, but they didn't change anything. They didn't make me feel guilt or sorrow. I didn't cry anymore. I was too tired to cry. My emotions now were nothing but resolve, the certainty that this was the right decision. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to explain. Miranda called me, but I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say, nothing to justify. All I needed now was peace, the quiet in my soul. Whatever she said would never change the truth, would never heal the violation I had endured for so long. A message from Elliot, Caleb's cousin, was something I hadn't expected. "You handled this with dignity. I respect you." These words weren't praise, but they weren't criticism either. They were simply acknowledgement, a recognition that I had done the right thing, that I had chosen a path few dared to walk. A path filled with challenges, but in the end, I had stood firm. Everything gradually faded into the past. 6 months later, my home had returned to peace. The greenery on the porch bloomed with flowers, and soft yellow lights gently illuminated the house. No more noise, no more imposition, no more feeling watched or controlled. Everything had settled into the rhythm of my own life. The house was no longer just a physical space. It had become a part of me, a place where I found freedom and quiet within myself. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to show anger or do anything to make them regret it. I only had to do one thing: erase them from my life. And I did it completely. In silence. Neatly. Without noise or chaos. Everything was resolved through my calm, through the resolve I had found after so many months of struggle. I had lost a marriage I had once hoped would bring happiness, but in the end, it was only betrayal. But what mattered far more was that I had found myself again. I had found absolute freedom, not somewhere else, but right within the space that belonged to me. A space I created, a space I had the right to own. And that was something no one could ever take from me again.